Hey, welcome to this know-how video. We're going to be talking about how to adapt your training to the heat, which is obviously very topical at the moment. I think just to start off with, the real key challenge ultimately is about keeping your core temperature down. And it's important to accept really that when it's as hot as it is at the moment, you are not going to be able to train or perform at the same level as you might otherwise do. It's really important to accept that. The heat will impact your ability to compete. It will impact your ability to train, and you need to adapt accordingly. You can't just carry on doing things the way that you normally do. Um, yeah, so it's important to accept that, okay, rather than try and fight against it. Work with it and adapt accordingly. It's dangerous basically to try and train the way that you might otherwise do, particularly in terms of intensity. Um, for those that are training to race in a hot environment, though, I will also provide a few little tips for you as to how you can coach your body into adapting for race day, because it is important that you do kind of prepare accordingly for your race if it is going to be in a hot climate. But just starting off in terms of how to structure your training, I think this is probably where the key points really are. And somewhat, we'll start off with some obvious stuff. So try to get your training done as early as possible in the morning. It's not going to be enjoyable if you're not a morning person, but it's really worth taking the hit, because training in the afternoons and evenings when it's much warmer can really compromise your ability to train, full stop, really, and probably your motivation to train as well, and can be quite unsafe, particularly in the UK, because we're just not used to these sorts of temperatures. And it's not only because of the heat at the actual time that you'll be training that you kind of need to be wary of, but it's because you will have spent the entire day kind of slightly uncomfortable, very warm, getting increasingly dehydrated. Even if you're kind of with the best will in the world, drinking lots of fluids, chances are you might be pretty dehydrated. And so your body will be battling all day long to try and keep your core temperature down. So training in the afternoons and evenings, unless you're in a lovely air-conditioned environment, you may well already be compromised before you even start the session. So try and get out as early as possible. May not be enjoyable getting up early, but honestly, it's the only way, really. Another point: plan any kind of run days for days that are forecasted to be a bit cooler. So running, naturally, because of the nature of running being pretty much a full body exercise, constantly working against gravity to drive yourself forwards, your heart rate will naturally sit higher than any of the other disciplines. So cycling and swimming, pretty much non-weight bearing, whereas running is obviously the opposite. And yeah, running is the one where I think you have to be the most careful. If you are an experienced athlete, or you're coming towards a big event and you're doing sort of double session days where you're training in the morning and then in the evening as well, plan those evening sessions carefully. Plan for sessions, make sure the evening sessions are sessions that can be done ideally inside in a nicely air-conditioned gym or home setup. So really, you're probably looking at doing kind of swims or turbo sessions in the evenings, and then doing kind of like your outdoors training in the mornings as much as possible. If you don't have access to a lovely air-conditioned environment, there are obviously things that you can do. The main one really for training indoors when it's hot, and probably just good advice generally, is ventilation. So get all the windows open, get a fan on you, but most importantly, get the windows open. Because yes, whether it's hot or not is not such a big deal, but if you're training in like a enclosed environment like I'm in at the moment, and you haven't got very good ventilation, basically as your breathing rate increases, you're gonna be pumping hot, moist air into the atmosphere around you, which is together going to increase the temperature of the room and also reduce the oxygen content or availability. So ventilation is super key when it's hot like this. Obviously you want cooling, you want a fan, maybe even putting a bowl of water in front of the fan so it's blowing kind of cooler air on you. But again, that's going to add to the moisture content of the room. So bit of a balancing exercise, but the main thing is ventilation, if you're not in a lovely air-conditioned gym. In terms of training, planning your training kind of at a weekly level, reduce overall intensity. Just do it. Don't even try and, fudge it so that you're still getting lots and lots of intensity. Reduce the overall intensity. Just do it. Make any high intensity sessions that you do actually perform. Reduce the duration, make them shorter, and reduce the extent of the intensity at a number of intervals perhaps. So this might seem like sacrilege to some of you, but you simply will not be able to perform those high intensity sessions in the same manner as which you are perhaps accustomed to. It's not something you should even bother fighting, to be honest. So you'll still gain a big training effect, even with a reduced load, with reduced intensity, because your body will be working so much harder. So just have a little think about it. You're not really going to be losing anything, and ultimately we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for consistency. And so you just got to adapt your overall weekly plan to ensure that you are maintaining consistency whilst we go through a very hot period. Your body will be the best guide. So if it comes to a session and you're feeling lethargic, and perhaps it's a higher intensity session and you're just not feeling it, adjust it. We're not looking to kind of suffer during, it's going to be miserable anyway when it's this hot, but we're not looking to suffer, because if you've always got to bear in mind that the deeper you go in a session, the harder you're working, the more grueling it is, the more recovery you're going to need. So it's not really worth kind of destroying yourself in an overly hot environment with too much intensity, because ultimately you'll pay for it and it's going to have a knock-on effect to your other training sessions. So I think that's a really key point to make in terms of kind of taking the ego out of the situation and just adapting, not even fighting it. So just ultimately accept you can't train in the same way, and your goal is to maintain consistency and high quality training rather than kind of sticking to an arbitrary plan, which I imagine was not prepared with sort of 38-40 degrees in mind. So moving more specifically onto adapting individual sessions, make sure you adapt them to the conditions that you're experiencing in the now, rather than, again, trying to perform a session arbitrarily. Okay, so the key adaptations you should be making are to try and keep your core temperature down as best as you can. So training the shade as much as possible, which is again a pretty obvious one, but sometimes you need just to be told. We all need that sometimes. Plan routes that are more shaded. And one thing that you might not have thought about is trying to get off-road as much as possible. So pavements and tarmac, they're like mirrors for heat. We've all will have experienced it when you're walking around cities, perhaps when you're abroad, or even if you're in sort of UK cities now. The heat just bounces off the pavements, and it creates like a bit of a pressure cooker environment, and it's pretty horrible. So training on the trails will be much cooler. I actually saw a report the other day that was comparing kind of inner urban areas to kind of areas just outside, and it was pretty surprising. Like areas just outside major urban areas were 7 degrees cooler on average during conditions like this. So if you can get out and hit the trails, not only will be more shaded, and there'll be lack of concrete and tarmac kind of reflecting the heat off you, but it's just generally going to be much cooler. I think they call them heat islands, something like that, where these urban areas where it kind of just acts like a convection cooker. Adapt the session plan. Kind of covered this already, but reduce intensity again. If you have, as an example, say you're doing hill reps, running or cycling, if you've got 8, change that to 5 or 6, and change the intensity at which you perform them. So if your efforts are normally full gas, go for 80% of max, Okay, like as I said earlier, our goal is consistency. So it's not kind of turning ourselves inside out, working much harder than normal, because anytime you do that, you're going to need extra recovery, and that's going to have a knock-on effect. Yeah, as I say, your session shouldn't be excruciating. So just kind of give yourself a bit of a break on that one. Yeah, you don't want to compromise your overall weekly plan just to do one specific session. Really not worth it. With longer runs, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is to do multiple short loops. It might be a little bit boring. I personally hate doing loops because anytime you go past where you're starting from or your finish line, I find it hard to keep going. So do multiple loops though. Going past your house or wherever you're training out of, so that you can just drop in quickly, grab a quick bit of shade, and replenish your fluid supplies. Okay, I did this quite recently when I was out in Portugal training, and it worked really well. So alongside getting out early, just stopping for a few minutes at a time just to quickly grab some more fluids, and also down a whole load of water or hydration drink, just kind of really kind of top yourself up again. Those few minutes that you kind of waste whilst you're inside refueling, in the scheme of things, it won't affect. You still got that overall duration to do, so it's really not a big deal. So don't worry about the fact that your long run isn't one continuous effort. Okay, it's more important that you are managing the heat and your core temperature. Make sure that you always have a proper hydration drink with you, whatever session you're doing. Plain water is not ideal when it's this hot, because basically plain water will just sit in your stomach for longer, because it hasn't got anything to help it across your gut. So having a low carb hydration drink, something that's kind of less than 4% carbohydrate concentration, along with some electrolytes in it, or a pure kind of electrolyte drink, those would be ideal because they're going to be optimal in terms of helping fluids transport across your gut. Carbohydrate and sodium are key vectors for assisting with fluid transfer across your gut. So anything when you're training, making sure that what you're drinking is optimal in terms of hydration. Steer clear of kind of pure carbohydrate drinks. I won't name any brands, but if it's more than a 4% carbohydrate concentration, you're not going to be optimally rehydrating. Okay, so make sure your drink is properly hydration focused. Keep an eye on your heart rate. Okay, so it's likely that your heart rate will be elevated, so you might have to adjust your pace, particularly if you're doing a longer low intensity session. Reduce your pace. You'll likely have to keep your heart rate down to where it should be. Races, if we're thinking about marathon times, when marathons are done in extreme heat, they're always much slower. Likewise, if it's in a really cold environment, there's very much a sweet spot for performance when it comes to things like marathons, etc. So just if that's happening with the pros, it's going to be happening with you too. So just be willing to drop your pace in order to keep your heart rate down a little bit, and that in turn will help keep your core temperature down. I've kind of already discussed breaking up your sessions with water breaks in terms of long runs, but do it all in all your sessions if you can. So if you're doing any kind of speed work or tempo running, what have you, again, doing shorter loops and having dedicated breaks within your session to properly rehydrate, it will just help you get through the session in a higher quality fashion, rather than forcing yourself to complete a session arbitrarily. And then finally, what I wanted to talk about is for anybody that is due to be racing in a hot environment in the next weeks, months, or what have you. Of course, you will need to prepare your body for racing in that heat. But this needs to be a gradual process and should be conducted very carefully. So if you're thinking at the moment it's very hot, this is a great time to kind of prepare your body for the heat that you might be experiencing in your events in an exotic place. You have to be really careful. Okay, so I think the way I can an analogy I think I can draw is when pro athletes go off to high altitude camps. They do not train in the same way when they first get there that they might ordinarily. It's all relatively short, low intensity training because there's an absence of oxygen and they haven't started kind of producing those extra red blood cells that we all know happens when you're at higher altitude, and that's why they do it. Their body doesn't adapt immediately. It takes several days. So for maybe like first 5 to a week, 5 days to a week, their training will be very different to how it would be ordinarily, as they just are looking at kind of giving their body extra capacity to coax it into kind of adapting to the higher altitude. And training in the heat or preparing your body to race in the heat is a very similar process. So any training that you do in the heat of the day in order to try and prepare for that event, it should be short duration and low intensity and built up very slowly. And of course, you still have to do all the things that you would do in a race to mitigate the effects of the heat. So there is no benefit to say, if you're training in the heat of the day to kind of just running in the sun. You wouldn't do that in the race. In the race, you would be looking for every little bit of shade. You'd be looking for every bit of fluids. You'd be pouring cold water on yourself, etc. So if you're looking to prepare your body for a hot race, do all the things that you would do in a race in order to kind of keep that core temperature down and give your body that capacity to adapt. But as I say, it's a slow process. It's not going to be done in a couple of days like we've potentially got of this heat wave. Okay, it needs to be kind of done over weeks rather than days. And plan your sessions to mitigate these effects. So the run loops idea that I've given you earlier to replenish fluid supplies. If you're doing an Ironman triathlon, for example, there's going to be multiple aid stations. So every kind of 2.5K, there'd be an aid station. So your training should kind of reflect that as well. You're getting on regular fluids. These sessions where you're specifically looking to adapt to the heat for that hot event, it shouldn't be every single session that you do. Okay, you should still follow all the advice that I've kind of given earlier in terms of like adapting your overall training early in the morning for the vast majority of your sessions. The kind of race preparation sessions where you look to adapt to the heat, they should be specific sessions and few in number. Okay, so identify specific sessions in which you're going to kind of have a race preparation session and be training in that kind of heat. But again, if it's a day like today and tomorrow where it's going to be close to 40 degrees, it's unlikely that your event is going to be that hot, I imagine. Okay, so those are not days to be doing race preparation heat training. Okay, you want the conditions to be relatively similar to those anticipated for your race. Okay, it can get a bit complicated, and this is where a coach comes in. But just a couple of points: if you're preparing to race in a hot environment, it has to be done very carefully, and not every single one of your sessions should be done in the heat of the day, and it needs to be a gradual, slow process done over weeks rather than days. Okay, anyway, I think that's enough, but hopefully some helpful information there. And as always, guys, if you've got any particular questions, do always feel free to drop us a line, either by email, info@riak.fitness, or on social media, just send us a DM. But there you go, guys. Stay safe, and hopefully you're still able to remain consistent. Good luck.